The auctioneer dropped the gavel at $75, and somewhere near the back of the courthouse lawn, a man in a bright red sport coat laughed loud enough that the pigeons on the roof of the feed mill lifted off in a startled gray cloud. It was the 14th of September, 1986, in the town of Blackwater Ridge, Kentucky, and the county sheriff's office was clearing out the last of the unclaimed property from the old Delaney Pawn and Loan. Most of what was left had already been picked over. Cheap rifles with cracked stocks, watches with dead movements, a guitar with no strings. And then, the very end, when the crowd had begun to thin and the sun was leaning hard against the western maples, they wheeled out the lockbox. It was an ugly thing. A squat, cast-iron pawnshop safe, of the kind that used to sit bolted to the floor behind the counter in every small town in America, roughly the size of a hay bale, painted a dull green that had gone almost black with soot from a fire that had passed through the shop's back room in 1975. The handle was snapped off at the base. The dial was gone entirely torn out and lost, leaving only a ragged hole where the combination spindle had once been. The keyway on the secondary lock was jammed with what looked like solder or slag. The whole face of the thing was blistered and warped, and one of the hinges had sprung so that the door sat crooked in its frame. The sheriff's deputy read the lot number in a bored voice. "Nobody bid," the auctioneer coaxed. Still nobody bid. And then, from a folding chair set back beneath the shade of a sycamore, an old man raised one finger, no higher than his ear, and said, "75. His name was Elias Warner. Lean, stooped a little at the shoulders from 49 years bent over benches and workbenches and the tumblers of other people's locks. His face was deeply lined, weathered brown at the temples, where his work cap did not shade it, and his eyes were the pale, steady gray of river ice. He wore a chambray shirt washed so many times it had gone the color of a robin's egg, a canvas jacket the color of old straw, and boots that had been resoled 3 separate times by a cobbler 2 counties over. His hands, resting on the knees of his work trousers, were the hands of a man who had spent a life inside small metal spaces, scarred across the knuckles. 2 fingernails on the left ridged where they had grown back wrong after a hammer strike in 1962. The palms shiny and pale from the constant handling of steel. The man in the red sport coat was Dwight Corley. He was 49. Heavy-set through the middle, clean-shaven, ruddy at the cheeks and neck, he ran Corley Discount Appliance out on the highway, and he wore a gold pinky ring, a gold neck chain, and a gold watch that flashed whenever he lifted his arm. His pickup, parked at the curb behind him, was a bright new red Chevrolet with the dealer's sticker still curled on the back window. He clapped his hands once and hooted. "Elias," he called across the lawn, "you paid dis 75 American dollars for a boat anchor. That thing ain't opened in a decade. Ain't nobody opened it. Sheriff's man tried. Locksmith from Owensboro tried. That there is what you call a paperweight, and even then it's too heavy to keep the paper from blowing off." There was some laughter. Not mean, most of it. Just the ordinary laughter of a small town watching one of its old men make a decision nobody quite understood. Elias did not answer. He did not turn his head. He did not smile. He counted $75 out of a leather billfold that had been mended along one seam with dental floss, and he handed the money to the deputy, and he signed the receipt with a pencil. What none of them knew, and what Elias himself only half suspected, was that the Delaney lockbox had a false floor. It had been welded shut from the inside 22 years earlier by a man who was already dying, and the contents of the space beneath that false floor were the reason a woman named Ruth Delaney had spent the last 2 decades of her life being called the widow of a thief. But that part of the story would take some time to arrive. Elias had learned his trade under a man named Amos Prine, who had run a locksmith and safe shop out of the back of a barber shop in Bowling Green from 1934. Amos had been a small, bird-boned man with white hair combed back tight against his skull, and he had taught Elias 2 things that mattered more than all the rest. The first was that every lock is a story someone else has already begun. The second was that a man who forces a lock has told you what he thinks of the person who owned it, and a man who coaxes one open has told you what he thinks of himself. Amos said a lock is patient, so you must be more patient. Amos said, steel remembers. Amos said, when you cannot see the tumblers, listen for them, and when you cannot hear them, feel for them, and when you cannot feel them, wait until you can. Elias had waited a great deal in his life. He had waited out a wife who left him in 1971 and came back in 1973 and left again in 1974 for good. He had waited out the closing of the railroad shop, where he had also welded for 15 years. He had waited out a bad heart scare in 1981 that had put him in the county hospital for 9 days. He waited the way other men breathe. So when he walked slow around that squat, fire-blistered lockbox on the courthouse lawn, and when he laid his palm flat against the side of it, and when he closed his eyes for the space of 3 long breaths, he was not appraising it in the way that Dwight Corley thought he was. He was not calculating scrap weight or thinking about resale. He was listening the way Amos had taught him to listen, and what he had heard, or thought he had heard, or perhaps only felt, through the thickness of 49 years of practice, was the small, dry sound of paper. Paper inside a box that had been declared empty by 3 different men in 3 different years. The deputies helped him load it onto the bed of his 1968 Ford, which had once been blue and was now mostly the color of primer and dust. The truck sagged visibly on its springs. Dwight Corley, watching from the sidewalk with a cigarette in his hand, called out one last thing before Elias pulled away. "You get that boat anchor open, old-timer," he said, "and I'll eat my hat right here on the square." Elias touched the brim of his cap with 2 fingers. That was the whole of his answer. He drove home at 28 miles an hour, taking the long way around, because the short way had a bridge with a posted weight limit that the loaded truck would not have honored, and by the time he pulled into the gravel yard behind his shop, the crickets had started up in the pasture. There is a kind of patience that looks like weakness right up until the moment it doesn't. Dwight Corley read price tags, and Elias Warner read locks, and that was the whole distance between them, though neither of them would have put it quite that way. By the next morning, the story of the $75 boat anchor was already halfway around Blackwater Ridge. It got told at the counter of the Ridge Diner, over eggs and coffee. It got told at the co-op while men waited for their feed to be loaded. It got told at the barber shop, where the barber, whose name was Hollis, told it twice. Once to the man in the chair. The name stuck, the boat anchor. For a whole week you could not go into any building in that town where men gathered without hearing somebody use that phrase and somebody else laugh. An old friend of Elias's, a retired mechanic named Carl Buford, drove out to the shop on the 3rd day. Carl was 71, walked with a cane after a hip he had never let anyone fix properly, and he had known Elias since 1949. He stood in the doorway of the shop with the cane hooked over his wrist and watched Elias work for a while before he spoke. "Elias," he said finally, "the whole town's saying you lost your mind." Elias was sitting on a low steel stool with a jeweler's loop pressed against his eye and a thin steel pick held between his thumb and forefinger. He did not look up. "It'll open," he said. When it was clear no further explanation was coming, he sighed the sigh of a man who had known Elias Warner for 37 years. And he limped back out to his truck, and he drove home. And he told his wife that Elias was fine, only stubborn. Elias worked on the box for 11 days. He worked on it in the evenings, mostly, after he had finished the paying jobs, the Rickeys and the busted deadbolts and the one call out to the Presbyterian church where the sexton had lost the key to the bell tower. He worked on it under a green metal lamp bent low over his bench, with a mug of coffee going cold beside his elbow. He did not force it. He did not drill. Amos Prine had said, in his high, dry voice, that drilling a safe was the confession of a man who had run out of ideas. And Elias had not run out of ideas. He sketched the face of the lockbox on a sheet of butcher paper and marked in pencil every burn, every warp, every place where the fire of 1975 had done its work. He identified the make, Mosler out of Hamilton, Ohio, manufactured in 1927 by his estimation, a common enough model for a small merchant shop. He knew the internal geometry of that model the way a country doctor knows the geography of the human abdomen. He knew where the relockers sat. He knew where the drive cam turned. He knew, above all, that the jammed keyway on the secondary lock was not a factory feature. Somebody had filled it. Somebody at some point had wanted very badly for that second lock never to be opened by a key. That told him something. It told him the answer was not the key. He worked from the hinge side instead, slow, methodical. He removed the outer plate one machine screw at a time, and where the heat of the old fire had welded the screws into their threads, he heated them again with a small torch, and he cooled them with a damp rag. It took him 2 evenings just to get the outer plate off. Beneath it was the linkage he had expected, and beneath that was the bolt work. And the bolt work, when he saw it, told him the rest of the story in a single glance. Someone had welded the primary bolt into its extended position from the inside. Not a factory weld, a field weld. A quick, purposeful weld laid down by a man who had almost certainly known he would not live to unlock this box himself, and who had wanted to be sure that no ordinary thief and no ordinary locksmith would ever open it in a hurry. Elias sat back on his stool and looked at that weld for a long time. He knew that weld, not the specific one, but the type of it. He had laid down welds like it in 1944 in a shipyard in Norfolk when he was 19 years old, and every rivet mattered. He recognized the bead. He recognized the angle. He recognized the hand, or at least the era of the hand. He said out loud to nobody in the empty shop, "Well, all right then." And he went to work on the weld. He did not cut it. Cutting it would have destroyed the boltwork behind it, and possibly he heated it instead in slow, controlled passes with the torch, and he worked at it with a small chisel he had ground down himself for exactly this kind of job, and he took the weld off in flakes the size of a fingernail paring, and he did this for 4 full evenings, and on the 11th night, the last flake of that old weld came away, and the bolt-work inside the lockbox settled with a soft, deliberate clunk, and the door of the lockbox eased open on its own weight by the width of a thumb. The sound of it was not dramatic. It was the sound of a held breath, finally letting go. After 22 years of holding, Elias did not open the door the rest of the way. Not yet. He set down his tools, he wiped his hands on a shop rag, he turned off the torch and coiled the hose. He drank the last swallow of cold coffee out of the mug on his bench. And then he stood and he took off his work cap, and he held it in both hands, the way a man holds his hat at a graveside, because he had already begun to suspect what he was about to find, and he wanted to give whoever had sealed that box the small dignity of a moment's respect before the seal was broken for good. Then he opened the door. There was a false floor. He had known there would be. He lifted it out with the tip of a screwdriver, and beneath it, in the shallow space of maybe 4 inches by the first, was a canvas bank bag, gone brown with age, tied at the neck with waxed twine. It was heavy in a way that told him what was inside before he opened it, and when he did open it, 12 of them, each about the size of a domino, each stamped with a refiner's mark he recognized from the old Louisville assay office. He weighed them in his palm one at a time and did not try to calculate. The second was a folded manila envelope, sealed with red wax, containing a set of legal papers, deeds, bills of sale, a signed and witnessed statement of account from the First National Bank of Blackwater Ridge, dated the 3rd of March, 1964, showing that a loan of $18,000, which had been declared unpaid at the death of one Thomas Delaney later that same year, had in fact been paid in full in cash 6 days before his death. The bank's receipt was there, stamped, countersigned by a teller named Marcus Hooper. Marcus Hooper, Elias knew because he had gone to school with him, had died in a car accident in 1965, 6 months after Thomas Delaney, which was, Elias thought. The third thing was a letter in a plain white envelope, addressed in a shaky, deliberate hand, to whoever opens this. Elias sat down on the stool and read it under the green lamp. To whoever opens this, the letter began. My name is Thomas Delaney, and if you are reading this, then I have been dead for some time, and my Ruth has likely been made to answer for debts that were never truly ours. I paid the bank on the 26th of February. Marcus Hooper took the cash and gave me the receipt you now hold. On the 2nd of March, Mr. Halloran of the bank called me in and told me the payment could not be found in the ledger and that I would need to pay again or the shop would be seized. I did not pay again because I did not have it to pay. What I had left in the world after that payment is in this box, in the form God allowed me to save it in, and it belongs to my Ruth and to no other living soul. I am setting this box against the day my name is cleared. I do not know when that day will come. I am not a well man. If you are the one who opens this, I ask you as a Christian and as a stranger to see that these papers and this gold reach my wife Ruth Delaney, or if she is gone, my daughter Sarah. Tell them I paid. Tell them I did not steal. Tell them I loved them the whole way down. Signed, Thomas Delaney, the 9th of March, 1964. Elias read the letter twice. Then he folded it and put it back into its envelope and set it on the bench beside the gold and the deeds, and he sat there in the yellow-green light of the lamp for a long time, He could have kept it. He knew that. 12 small gold ingots, and no living witness to know they had ever existed. He could have driven up to Louisville and sold them a piece at a time over the course of 2 or 3 years, and no one in Blackwater Ridge would have ever been the wiser. He could have died a wealthy old man in a house that did not leak at the porch corner, and no one would ever have known. He put on his work cap. He put the letter and the deeds and the gold into an old leather satchel Amos Prine had left him in 1958, and he drove into town. Ruth Delaney was 74 years old and living in a 2-room apartment above the drugstore on Main Street. Her daughter Sarah, 50 and tired, had come down from Cincinnati to help her mother through what everyone believed would be her last winter. Ruth had been called the widow of a thief for 22 years. She had lost the shop, the house on Elm, her husband's good name, and most of her friends. She answered the door in a blue housecoat and a look of practiced patience for whatever bad news the world had brought her this time. Alias took off his cap. "Mrs. Delaney," he said, "I bought your husband's lockbox at the county auction. I opened it last night. There are some things inside that belong to you." He set the satchel on her kitchen table. He opened it. He laid the letter down first, and then the deeds, and then the bank receipt, and then the gold. Sarah put her hand over her mouth. Ruth did not move for a full minute. Then she sat down very slowly in a kitchen chair that creaked under her, and she picked up the letter, and she read it, and she began to cry in the quiet way that old women cry who have run out of the loud kind years ago. Elias did not stay to be thanked. He said, "Ma'am, your husband was a careful man and an honest one, and he wanted you to know that he put his cap back on." He walked down the narrow stairs and out onto Main Street, and he drove home in the dark. The bank receipt went to a lawyer in Owensboro the next week. By the end of October, the First National Bank of Blackwater Ridge had issued a formal written apology to Ruth Delaney and paid a settlement whose exact amount was never made public, but which was by all accounts sufficient. The county paper ran the story on the front page under a photograph of Thomas Delaney taken in 1961, a thin, serious man with kind eyes standing in the doorway of his shop. The headline read, "Delaney cleared after 22 years. A locksmith found the proof." Dwight Corley did not eat his hat on the square. Nobody made him. But he was seen at the diner less often, and when he was seen he did not laugh the way he had laughed before, and he did not tell the story about the boat anchor anymore because nobody would have listened. His appliance business went under in the spring of 1989 for reasons that had more to do with a highway bypass than with Elias Warner, though the town liked to say otherwise. He moved to Florida the following year. The lockbox itself was cleaned in time and placed on a low pedestal inside the front window of the Blackwater Ridge Historical Society, with a small brass plaque beneath it that read, "The Delaney Lockbox, sealed 1964. Some truths keep." Elias went to see it once, on a Tuesday evening in November, when the society was closed and the streetlights had just come on. He stood on the sidewalk in his canvas jacket, with his hands in his pockets, and looked at the box through the glass for maybe 2 minutes. Then he touched the brim of his cap the way he had at the auction, and he walked back to his truck, and he drove home to the shop, where a young man of 19 named Peter Halligan was waiting in the doorway with a broken padlock in his hand and a look of quiet, hopeful patience on his face, having come as he came 3 evenings a week now to learn. So I'll leave it with you. 12 small ingots of gold, a dead man's letter, and no living soul who knew they existed, would you have carried that satchel up the narrow stairs above the drugstore and set it on Ruth Delaney's kitchen table? Or would you have driven the long way to Louisville instead?